Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas, Lance Stroll, and Yuki Tsunoda faced the immediate threat of grid penalties that would have destroyed their Zandvoort sprint results before the lights even went out. 5 drivers were formally referred to the FIA stewards for allegedly failing to follow race director Rui Marquez's Item 24 grid procedure instruction, a breach that carried the risk of sporting sanctions under Article 12. 2.1.I of the International Sporting Code. The allegation was specific and procedural. Each driver stopped their car before reaching safety car line 1 while driving to the grid ahead of the sprint, meaning they did not reach the grid under their own power as required by the event notes. This was not a technical infringement regarding car legality, but a direct challenge to race control authority during one of the most chaotic formation periods of the 2026 season. The tension here is not just about whether these 5 drivers broke a rule, but why the stewards ultimately decided that breaking it was the only safe option available to them. We know the verdict cleared everyone, yet the official reasoning exposes a fundamental flaw in how the Zandvoort pit lane handles modern Formula 1 traffic that could easily have gone the other way. Why did the governing body choose to validate a technical breach rather than punish it? And what does that decision tell us about the physical limits of this circuit when 20 cars try to occupy a space that simply cannot hold them all? That question hangs over every single procedural investigation at this track, because the margin between appropriate safety and competitive advantage is measured in meters of asphalt that do not exist here. GP Blog framed this moment as half the F1 grid facing an FIA investigation, emphasizing the sheer scale of the sweep. Tsunoda's car was flagged at 11,034,012. Verstappen followed 2 seconds later at 11,034,026. Hamilton was logged at 11,034,056. These timestamps illustrate a compressed window where multiple championship contenders were simultaneously non-compliant with the same directive. Racing News 365 confirmed independently that the investigations were opened in quick succession shortly before the sprint start, creating a scenario where stewards had to adjudicate on mass non-compliance in real time. The rule exists to ensure orderly grid formation, yet the enforcement mechanism collided with physical reality. Cars were backing up, space was vanishing. Drivers were forced to choose between obeying a line on the track or avoiding a collision in a bottleneck that has no overflow capacity. So where does that leave the integrity of the procedure itself? The stewards had to weigh mitigating circumstances against written regulations, knowing that penalizing 5 drivers for the same congestion-related stop would have artificially reshuffled the entire sprint grid. This discretion is built into the system, but it creates uncertainty every time the pit lane gets crowded. We are looking at a moment where the rulebook met infrastructure limitations head-on. The outcome preserved the results, with Verstappen keeping P6 and Hamilton keeping P7, but the process revealed how fragile grid procedures become when venue design cannot accommodate current sporting codes. The drivers escaped sanction, but the underlying problem that triggered the investigation remains unresolved for future events at this high-banked, narrow venue. The official verdict document released by the FIA stewards provides the exact justification for clearing all 5 drivers without penalty. Racing News 365 and GPMNs both quoted the ruling near verbatim, stating that as the end of the grid was extremely crowded when the car reached the grid, the stewards determined that the driver acted appropriately and stopped the car in a safe spot as close as possible to the grid. This language is critical because it reframes non-compliance as a necessary safety adaptation rather than a competitive infraction. The stewards were not saying the rule was wrong. They were acknowledging that enforcing it strictly under those specific conditions would have created a greater hazard than the breach itself. Grid congestion. Space vanished. Safety prevailed. Planet F1 reported the verdict specifically regarding Car 3, noting that while Verstappen stopped before reaching safety car line 1 and therefore did not reach the grid under its own power, the stewards still determined the driver acted appropriately. This distinction matters enormously for future precedent at Zandvoort. It establishes that the physical layout of the pit straight can serve as a valid defense against procedural penalties, effectively making the circuit architecture a mitigating factor in sporting code enforcement. Article 12. I covers non-compliance with any instruction given by the race director, which typically carries strict liability, yet here we see discretion applied based on venue-specific constraints. What happens when the rulebook assumes infrastructure that simply does not exist? Zandvoort's narrow pit, straight and high-banked layout create a natural choke point that multiple outlets cited as the root practical cause of this entire investigation. Unlike modern circuits with expansive grid boxes and wide assembly areas, this historic venue forces 20 cars into a confined space that was never designed for contemporary Formula 1 machinery. The drivers were not stopping early to gain an advantage or manage temperatures. They were stopping because the cars ahead of them had nowhere else to go. Tsunoda, substituting for Racing Bulls that weekend, was caught in the same bottleneck as the championship leaders. Bottas in the Cadillac and Stroll in the Aston Martin faced identical spatial limitations. The uniformity of the breach across 5 different teams suggests systemic failure rather than individual error. Let's be clear about what was actually at stake procedurally. This was never about car legality or technical compliance. There was no allegation of an illegal car in this investigation. The charge was purely administrative concerning how cars must physically position themselves before a race start, yet the potential consequences were entirely sporting. Grid penalty applied to 5 drivers would have cascaded through the entire field, promoting lower-placed cars and fundamentally altering the sprint competitive balance. The stewards recognized that punishing congestion caused by venue limitations would have been punitive rather than corrective. Their decision reflects established discretion within the International Sporting Code to weigh context over strict adherence when safety is the overriding concern. So, what does this mass clearance actually mean for the rest of the weekend? Racing News 36.5 covered this story in 2 distinct stages, first reporting the investigation opening and then publishing a separate verdict piece once the no-penalty outcome was confirmed. This 2-stage coverage pattern illustrates how developing steward decisions unfold across active sessions. The initial headline emphasized multiple drivers facing scrutiny. The follow-up confirmed resolution without sanction. Between those 2 articles, the entire sprint took place with results intact. Verstappen finished P6, Hamilton finished P7. No points were redistributed, no positions changed hands. The investigation existed parallel to the racing, creating procedural tension without competitive disruption. The Judge 13. Con headlined their coverage asking why Hamilton and Verstappen escaped sanction, framing the outcome as noteworthy precisely because mass investigations typically yield at least some penalties. 5 drivers, 1 verdict, 0 sanctions. The timing detail from GP blog shows just how compressed this entire situation was. Tsunoda flagged at 11,000-4,012, Verstappen at 11,000-26, Hamilton at 11,034,006. That 44-second window encapsulates the entire crisis. 5 separate incidents logged in under a minute. Stewards reviewing footage and telemetry while cars were still forming up. Decisions rendered before the sprint began. This is not deliberation over days. This is real-time adjudication under extreme time pressure, where getting it wrong either way creates controversy. Clearing everyone risks appearing lenient. Penalizing everyone risks appearing blind to context. The stewards chose the path that acknowledged physical reality over regulatory purity. Here is why this actually matters. The specific allegation under item 24 was not merely about stopping early, but about failing to reach the grid under a car's own power, a procedural requirement that exists to prevent unsafe speed differentials in the pit lane. When 5 drivers breach this simultaneously within a 44-second window, it signals that the regulation itself may be incompatible with Zandvoort's physical constraints during high-pressure formation laps. The investigations were logged in such rapid succession that Tsunoda's flag at 11,000, Verstappen's at 11,000-26, and Hamilton's at 11,000-34.56 essentially form a single continuous incident rather than 5 independent infractions. This compression transforms individual driver errors into a systemic venue failure, forcing stewards to adjudicate on infrastructure limitations disguised as sporting breaches. Rule met reality. Reality 1. The research confirms that Carlos Sainz was also summoned by stewards that same session, but for a completely separate and unrelated infringement involving driving unnecessarily slowly under Article 12, while managing his outlap delta after letting a car pass before turn 13. Several outlets initially blurred this distinction, with Sport Bible appearing to group him with the 5-driver grid investigation before Planet F1 clarified the separation. This conflation risk is significant because merging Sainz's delta time management case with the safety car line 1 grid stop breach would falsely suggest 6 drivers committed the same procedural error when in fact only 5 did. Precision here protects the integrity of both investigations. Sainz received a warning for his distinct offense, while the 5 grid stop drivers received no penalty for theirs. 2 separate stories. 1 chaotic session. What happens when media framing outpaces official documentation? GP Blog's headline emphasizing half the F1 grid facing investigation captured the scale accurately, but also amplified the perception of widespread non-compliance before context emerged. Racing News 365's 2-stage coverage model proved more resilient to this distortion, separating the initial referral from the final verdict. Com's headline questioning why Hamilton and Verstappen escaped sanction reflects the audience expectation that mass investigations yield penalties, making the no-action outcome newsworthy precisely because it defied precedent. Yet, none of these outlets explicitly connected this procedural drama to the main qualifying session that followed later that same day. The connective narrative between escaping steward scrutiny and then being beaten on track is editorial synthesis constructed from 2 independently confirmed same-day events, not a storyline reported as such by any source. Timing remains partially opaque. Sources confirm both the sprint investigation and main qualifying occurred on Saturday, August 22, 2026, with the sprint preceding qualifying, but no source establishes an exact minute-by-minute timeline connecting when the verdict was announced to when qualifying began. This gap means we cannot definitively state whether drivers entered qualifying knowing they had been cleared or still under procedural uncertainty. What we can confirm is that the qualifying result was unaffected by and had no procedural connection to the grid stop investigation. Lando Norris's pole lap and Verstappen's P7 finish exist in a separate competitive universe from the Item 24 breach, even though both unfolded within hours of each other at the same venue. No direct quote. Silence speaks. Critically, no verbatim on-record reaction from Verstappen himself about being cleared by the FIA investigation was found in this research pass. All confirmed quotes come from official stewards' verdict documents, not from press pen comments. Any narrative suggesting Verstappen personally addressed escaping the investigation would be inferred framing rather than sourced material. This absence is itself data. Whether he chose not to comment, was not asked, or simply moved focus to qualifying's pace deficit remains unknown. What is known is that his on-track performance in main qualifying was attributed by both himself and press coverage to lack of grip and balance in the RB22, not to any lingering effects of the steward investigation. The procedural clearance and competitive struggle occupied parallel tracks that never intersected in his documented statements. The steward's official verdict document, quoted independently by both Racing News 36.5 and GP fans, explicitly states that as the end of the grid was extremely crowded when the car reached the grid, the driver acted appropriately and stopped the car in a safe spot as close as possible to the grid. This precise wording confirms that the clearance was not an act of leniency but a formal recognition that strict compliance with Item 24 was physically impossible under the conditions present on August 22, 2026. Every single one of the 5 drivers retained their sprint results because the governing body accepted venue congestion as a legitimate mitigating factor under Article 12. Verdict clear, points intact. What does it mean for future events when infrastructure limitations become an accepted defense against procedural breaches? The research confirms this was a discretionary application of existing rules, not a reversal or leniency policy change by the FIA.